cover some of the topics that we've covered today, because part of it is I thought, okay, I can either put together some slides, or I can take what everyone talked about on day one, what everyone's going to talk about in for day two, and really give you some viewpoints on there. So I'm going to start talking a bit of an introduction to myself. So partly, there's a great episode which Neil published, did a podcast with me, and I know he's joined today as well. And he talked about time to quality, and I think that was a really nice idea which he came up with, but it also fits to this shift up concept around, well, what is people's perception of quality? And so there's some amazing sessions on there. Like I said, we hit the 50th episode just the other day. We got Damien there, who's again very inspirational about your career. The latest episode from Wayne and Thomas, who actually were in the booth yesterday on one of our sponsors. And also a good episode, which I'm going to refer to from Colton, who helped Amazon and do chaos engineering. But so we started the podcast just before COVID, I think it was, with an idea to kind of share these experiences. So I will put a link in there, and if people do genuinely want to come in, whatever speaking level you've got, I'm more than happy to spend some time with you. So Automation Cyborg. So this kind of stuck. I know I've known Joe Colantonio for I'm going to say decades now. We both kind of started off in the Mercury landscape back in the 90s. And yeah, he refers to me as kind of the automation cyborg, because he kind of says I've been kind of sent back in time to save the industry, shall we say. And yeah, so this is actually, I tried to dig out a slide from last time I followed from Alan Page's session, and I did this presentation. And actually at that point in time, Alan had contributed to the Experience Test Automations book, which Dorothy also would publish, so a collection of a number of different people. So, I'd recommend checking out that book. I will make sure the links get available to you. But, I realized the other day that actually I have spanned 4 decades in automation. And so, part of this talk was wanting to say, well, what's the landscape for tooling, right? What's changed from kind of where I started, and you can probably see on this left-hand side, XRunner, which was before WinRunner, and then QTP, now UFT. But before they even thought about the selenium poisoning, right? Mercury poisoning. So part of it is 4 decades, some great books. I was lucky enough to Iran, who's going to be one of our guests later on. We've just done a book that came out this year, which is Accelerating Software Quality, Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence. And people like Jason Arbin and the guys at Test AI and a few other good, amazing speakers have contributed to that book. I'd highly recommend it. We're going to be giving copies away. I'm going to be giving away copies as well for people who are on the social media and everything else. I wanted to also kind of talk a little bit about just kind of saying, contributing, it doesn't have to be a book, you can contribute to things like the Lean Pub. So there's a great example there of 80 software testers, exactly what Paul said, if you want to tell your story or your experience report, then, that's a great platform for it. And yeah, so, part of it is I'm sat on a book at the moment, which is going out on cognitive engineering, which is kind of testing AI systems, and going through it was a bit of a case study. So the Accelerating Software Quality book, I talk about my experience working with MIT for the COVID Path Check Foundation, helping people with the gains, which is the Google and Apple exposure notification, which is now on everyone's phone, to help track where we are, track and trace. And then also I'm just helping them now with the next one, which is a vaccine passport, which again, the idea behind it, what MIT were doing was to make it available for every country around the world, less developed countries that don't have digital health platforms in place. So there's some about that, the MIT work in that book, but there's also some more in the book that's coming out in the fall. So I kind of wanted to kind of throw in kind of what that lockdown experience was. And I didn't mean that the testers are in lockdown, even though potentially we are in lockdown. But we had a great opportunity to kind of come together and speak and do events and exchange ideas. And I guess this is kind of where the testing festival was born. Was we need to create a platform where we can all connect and talk to each other. And obviously I've kind of thrown in Mike's picture yesterday, just in case you didn't see him on the live stream because of some technical issues. But yeah, so obviously you can see James and Michael Bolton there. You've got some amazing people all coming together to try and work on things and put some ideas out there. So anyway, partly what I wanted to share with you, which was kind of the whole kind of original abstract, was the state of tooling. And so I kind of we got these results so as I mentioned, I'm the president of the Vivid worldwide community, which is the largest software independent software community. And we kind of said, let's put a survey out to 40,000 members and say, what are the tools that people are interested in? What are they using? And it was no kind of, it wasn't not like the Lord of the Rings. It was not one tool to rule them all, right? There's all sorts of a plethora of tools. So that's kind of, Mr. Trimp has just said, it's great that there's all these tools. And there was some really refreshing stuff yesterday around, from Alan Page saying, well, actually, I used to say, avoid these tools like the plague, the record replay kind of days. And he said, now there's some really smart tools out there what are really helpful. And he was actually an advocate for low code or even kind of codeless approaches. So, I think it's really interesting that things are changing, right? And I know, James Whitaker and, all these other people who are kind of coming back in saying, yeah, there's a great use case for AI and smarter testing tooling, or as kind of we've referred to it in day one as a toolsmith, or kind of these kind of assisted tooling. It's not going to be a replacement. So I wanted to set the first that there was this was a big independent study, and then second, kind of there were some great examples there from kind of our last speaker, talking about having experience working in aerospace or telco or financial services, different domains, like Chris has just come from the healthcare industry. Part of it is they all have different viewpoints, they all have different terminology that we use. It's all content sensitive, should we say, and I'm not going to go into the context camp or one or the other. I'm just going to kind of say, there is, this idea of understanding the different domains is maybe one of the greatest challenges that tool testers have is understanding the context and understanding the industry. So, there's nothing wrong with that, and keep on learning those domain skills, because they're definitely worth pursuing. And then, which kind of tool chain, and I'm not going to mention too much, but, so Paul, for the last probably 6 or 7 years, been working on something called tkbase.com, which was a tool repository, and he'll probably quote me on that. I've got the wrong number, but there were probably about 20,000 tools registered on there. And it's quite hard to navigate around, right? And there's a tool for a certain stage or a certain step or of every person's job, right? And if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It is very similar to that with tools that you use for maybe automation or performance or security. You find that you're probably pushing out the use cases a little bit more than they really should be. So we looked at different areas, and I mentioned today about this shift up, this kind of the barrier between kind of ALM products like Jura or ALM or Azure DevOps to PPM tools like Clarity and all these other ones that deal with the numbers, right, and all this other kind of stuff. And it'd be nice to see those disappearing, right, that they start coming to one. And of course, building your ALMs on top of your release management tools and your operational tools, you're starting to see the synergies that are starting to happen. And obviously analytics on top of those to use machine learning and some use cases around that. So lots of different tool chains. And like I said, I decided that I wouldn't go and make some slides. I'd talk over other people's ones and talk, kind of try and pull it all together, really. And one of Paul's sayings that he says is, we're always searching for technology solutions for human problems, right? And I think this is the thing, we'll have a look at the Gartner quadrant or the hype curve and we'll say, oh, we're not doing virtual personal assistants, or we're not doing smart contracts, or we're not doing serverless architecture. And you kind of go, yes, I understand that. And you know, I love this kind of concept that you can pretty much age a company by its technology, right? Is if it was a startup in the noughties, then you know, you've got a lot of microservices and APIs and open APIs and stuff. And then you take it, you know, back into the 90s, you might have some SOA kind of architectures. You know, part of it is the company's aged on there, and you know, there's this perception that you know, maybe the Silicon Valley companies, and you know, I've worked with the, you know, the Apples and the PayPals of the world, and you know, like PayPal use mainframe, right? They still use X.com, which was Elon Musk's company, which they acquired. You know, there's platforms from when they dated the company, right? So, you know, we can't have this perception that there's all this shiny new stuff that all these other companies are using and we need to get into it. But at the same time, it logically makes sense to make, you know, decisions around the kind of technologies and the platforms you're building. But that uncertainty, to be honest, is, and we talked about it with Dave Snowden's Seraphim framework yesterday. I'm not going to really dive into it much, but you know, part of it is we're managing that complexity, right? And it could be whatever tool we're using. So I wanted to throw in kind of the start with ALM. You know, I started with Test Director, and it literally looked like a spreadsheet. It was a standalone tool, and this was before they had a thick client version. And you know, in essence, it was Excel, right? And you know, it still is Excel. And you know, part of it is, you know, things have moved on. We're visualizing data in a completely different way, and from data visualization perspective, but underlining, we're still very simple with the kind of the structures that we use and the relationships of those data between different systems, and you know, the different meanings of priority or whatever it may be, right? So you know, I think we've got a long way to go, and I thought I'd give credit where credit's due. And my friend Stacy launched an AI company a month ago or something, and so I jumped in it, and I was just pulling in some Jira stuff because you know, that normal pet hate of, you know, okay, some jQuery stuff here that I can do, and I've got data in this system, how do I bring it all in? And then you know, there was the promise from certain tools that their predictive analytics would come in, so it'd start understanding based on historical information, you know, what you're trending at, you know, how are you closing enough per day, you know, is your velocity right, you know, all these kind of things which, you know, seem to be just magic tricks and promised to us by these organizations, and they never happened. And I think that's the thing. And you know, I got used to kind of, you know, taking this data out of an ALM or a Jira and stick it into some kind of streaming service, so like Elasticsearch or Kafka or something, and then you know, then consuming it from Grafana or something, so I could visualize this same kind of level. But what I hadn't done, which obviously these guys had done, which was, you know, adding the prediction stuff to say, well, you know, what can we expect if we carry on like we're doing based on historical information. And I think we've got to the size now that we've got so much historical information. It seems a bit of a shame that we're not actually doing anything with it. So that's ALM, and then I want to move on to kind of automation, which I suppose is the only area I should really be talking about. And you know, part of a lot, even what Chris kind of mentioned around UI, right? You know, there's this, and I guess what battle that's been going on for a very long time with, you know, and we've not really helped ourselves with doing pyramids and other things to try and kind of extract the abstraction layers of complexity, or abstract the complexity. So the fact that codeless, yes, is just another level of abstraction, and then we've got another level of abstraction, and everything's a level of abstraction until it's too complicated for us to actually perceive the architecture that lies underneath it. And so back, I don't know, probably what, 5 years ago, I said, well, everything's just a node, right? And you're interacting with that node or the path through it. And what's actually important with the node, whether it's an API, whether it's you know, an ESB, whether it's a UI, whatever it may be, is the data flow, is what the data that's coming in, is the link. So if for all of you guys or ladies who are using things like knowledge graphs or something like GraphQL or Neo4j or something, you start getting this kind of concept of relationships between these nodes and the links, and you can build up these quite complex domain models out of these knowledge graphs. And you know, to me, that's part of us getting to those kind of early stages of saying, well, I understand the relationship of an ecosystem of ecosystems, lots of systems and subsystems that all have to interact, all doing in essence ETLs, enhanced transforms and loads. And you've got to understand, well, what the relationship is, what's being applied there, what you should see as far as the data. And I think there's a lot more to it than maybe we've been going under the hood. So, people are quite confident with things like API testing, but then you kind of say, you introduce something like chaos engineering and saying, well, what if, your consumers or your producers from Kafka go down and you're not able to bring them up? What happens to that data? It's not TIBCO, so it's not like it's stuck somewhere, it'll come back online. You've got all these kind of questions about systemic failure and things like that, which I think we just need to address and stop focusing at layers and actually start looking a little bit more broader at it. So part of it is automation, right? So we surveyed, and there's a lot of great companies here for which are sponsoring this event, and some which have gone through some fairly serious acquisitions over the last couple of years. But moving on, part of it was, even if you're using a tool of any description, there's a pattern which you apply, so a blueprint or a schematic which you think in your back of your head. And the easy way to do this is say, oh, well, I'll just build a framework, which, I loved building frameworks in the 90s, but I had to stop myself. I had to say, no, I can't do this anymore. And, part of it was, we mentioned the cookbook. So I did a book many years ago on, which was just a code cookbook, a bit like what Angie's building at the moment. And I think it has its place. You've got your code components or semantics, which you're going to apply to it, or schematics of how that function, that bit of code should work. But then you've got these test automation patterns, which are from a management perspective, what reporting is, what people are looking at. So I think the whole thing is it's from the eye of the beholder in a way. Is that if you're looking at certain patterns, you need to do there, and then maybe you need to understand not just the blueprint but the schematic and bring that all together. So I think there's a bigger conversation that needs to happen here. And I love Paul's idea, and in a way, it feels like the idea that I had before with what I contributed to Dorothy's wiki when testautomationpatterns.org came out. I created one called Manumation, and the idea was using manual interaction to understand the relationship. And I remember doing it. It must have been 20 years ago now, where I connected ESAP adapters at a SAP GUI perspective with all this additional logging information and debugging information. So when people were executing an exploratory test using, in that case, it was Sprinter, and I was pulling all this information, which wasn't, UFT, it was actually just feeds of XML structure that I knew what was happening where at each node, so that I could, in theory, reverse engineer it and be able to push that out. So whether that would be the request response pairs of what's been sent from the client between into the middleware, or if it was actually the front end interactions to a DOM, right? So part of it is I wanted all that information in this kind of surveying mode, right? And this idea where you can then use it to automatically build models. And obviously for those who've heard me speak about this so many times, you can do this. There were a question yesterday around, fuzzy kind of things, but there's ways to self-generate and those models, whether you use a spider to transpose an entire site to undiscover all paths, or you use something more sophisticated like what Jason and Tarek are working on at test.ai. But part of it is I think there is this, but we've kind of not supported it anyway. So we had IntelliTest and Trace and all these other tools that gave us stack information. We just it wasn't something that we needed. And obviously for those who kind of know Michael and James, James is working on this kind of session-based testing kind of approach of what are the tools like Sprinter, what can help accelerate stuff. So as you're going through and doing exploratory, it captures stuff, right? As you're going through and you're doing all the work that's not just testing, like data prep and fixing problems and environment stuff, it's capturing all that, and it's kind of logging a day in the life. And I think, yeah, we should see these tools. And of course, Paul will have said, and I'm checking my timings now, he did actually genuinely hold up the watch afterwards, and it did say 1:45, so we will let him off for his timekeeping. But moving on, let's kind of talk about, you know, the question, and I'm thankfully going to skip through this really quickly in the sense of should you learn to code? And of course we had controversial, you know, conflicting viewpoints. You know, we had, you know, Alan on one side, or the Allens, two Allens on one side, and then Dot on the other. So I'll join Dot's side just to even it out a little bit and say that no, maybe you shouldn't. You know, there was this kind of, well, and there was some fantastic arguments around that from Alan Page about saying, well, from Alan Richardson, who kind of said, you know, well, once you understand what's going on and what they're doing as far as their craft, then you think about things differently, and it unlocks a whole stack of new thought processes. And I love that. But then I kind of think, well, that's the magic which maybe we don't need to know, because, you know, I remember seeing a keynote from Jeff Bezos, right, who kind of said, you know, if it's not explainable, then you know, like explainable AI, for instance, maybe it shouldn't exist, right? It's not a feature. And so to me, that kind of viewpoint was, well, yeah, you know, if I don't, and yes, we don't have requirements anymore, and I love requirements engineering and all the great stuff that Tom Gilbert done and Dot has done for you know, inspection and stuff like that. But you know, part of it is we don't have that anymore, so we don't actually, no one has explained to us what it is, and to us that we don't really know. We're having to find and discover this information, which is really what Paul was trying to say in the model for testing. But what came out of this conversation, which I loved, was the idea that they said, well, actually tools are helpful, right? And maybe you don't need to code, right? You know, maybe you can get away. And, you know, we used the joke, you know, well, Chris can do it, which hopefully will hashtag Chris can do it. Just do it from the Nike logo. You know, it became one of these kind of concepts that maybe you don't need that lower level of, you know, ability to understand which adapter or, you know, what SDK I need to be pulling in, but actually you need to understand enough to say, well, I'll generate something that's pretty basic, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to supercharge it by sticking it into all these great AI ML tools, whether that be computer vision like OpenCV or Aptly tools that can then see things that I can't see at different form factors on different devices in, you know, AWS Labs or Perfecto or, you know, App Center from Microsoft, you know, physical devices. And, you know, part of it is, well, yeah, that makes sense. You know, there should be a phase within my contract testing where I'm testing a payload and stuff like that. And yes, I'm seeing what that payload looked like on 40% of all my tool devices from Firebase and 40% of all my top devices on Google Analytics. And it should just do that. And yes, we used to just call it cross-browser testing or cross-device testing. Yes, it can do that, and it can do all the visual testing and does a lot more than just recognizing, yes, the DOM's rendered. That's not the end of it. But yeah, so we're starting to see these tools emerge that have a very focused line of objective, kind of value chain, shall we say. And that's really what I really liked about what Alan said. Is actually, are tools the answer? Probably no. Can tools help? Yes, and that's the whole thing. You wouldn't expect a builder to turn up and do everything with his bare hands. Things have evolved. You've got tools that help it, but don't just pick up the hammer. There's lots more other cool tools out there, and if anything, you should have a plethora of tools in your shiny toolbox that give you these kind of capabilities. And that doesn't mean just learn one language or, you know, one tool. Is you have to understand where the tool starts and finishes, and where it's, you know, where other tools should, you know, talk to it. And I know Wayne's going to be talking about the open test platform today, but it's this openness that's really important. This ability to leverage tools and them to be interchangeable, right? And that's something which I guess the industry's purposely not wanted us to do. But with things like Selenium W3C becoming a standard, you know, part of it is it has to become that, it has to go in that direction. So I love what Alan had to say. And, you know, I think, you know, like I said, there's a use case, and we're going to see, and I put this one in so we can fast forward into the future, but, you know, Angie's going to be talking later about it. And, you know, part of it is, I think there's some great use cases for this, some great use case for AI. There's some great use cases for exploratory testing and manual testing. You know, we just need to understand what that balance is. And maybe, you know, we shouldn't be going one, you know, never go full DevOps as a joke, you know, never go full software developer in test. You know, there has to be different, caps that we're wearing. You can't just be a performance engineer, right? Or you could, but you'd be missing out on an understanding all the data that's everywhere else in the life cycle. So I thought, well, we talked about codeless tools and free tools, so why not let you guys go out and pick up some tools and use it, right? And I think probably not 50% of these tools on here are free and open source. But I wanted to kind of just give them as an example, really. So in the bottom left-hand corner, I've started with EvoSuite. Now, if anyone's used EvoSuite, they'll know that it gives you the ability to automatically generate unit tests, right? So it uses AI libraries. It's open source, so go and use it, and it generates, all your unit tests you need. Brilliant, right? So that's my component tests maybe done if I'm doing some kind of BDD, TDD, ATDD, Cucumber, specification by example, Goico, whatever, right? But that seems like a really good idea, right? And then in the top left-hand corner, we've got Macintosh, which my friend Alon, who was the founder of BlazeMeter, but also one of the second big contributor to JMeter, has just released a company called brought a company called Up9, which uses AI to automatically generate all APIs, right, for a Swagger spec or an open API. And one of the things we'd always kind of been looking at was, is service virtualization. Of course, you'd be saying, well, I've got Wiremark, I don't need Macintosh, right? Or you might be saying, I've got, Mock Labs or something else. But actually, I think, part of it is it's beyond just mocks, shims and stubs now. It's actually to the point where SV, NV, NFV are really important. So service virtualization, network function virtualization, right? It's not just as simple. And, and I don't know why my clicker's not working today properly, but, the shift up approach to the business and this shift left approach to earlier in the life cycle and this shift right approach to operations and operational data. And then I dare not say it just in case I get banned from it next time, but this shift down to the customer, which we're doing anyway, but we don't call it down, is really important, right? Is this kind of concept around, you need to be looking in all directions. You can't just expect to, be part of your factory model, which is doing just the SDED kind of things and maybe throw it over the fence to a performance engineer. You need to be generating those stubs and shims that potentially the contracts and the payloads that you're doing feed into your performance engineering. And performance engineers need to kind of stop going, well, 1% failing is fine because they're all functional issues and we don't care about those, but actually feeding them back. There's so much data we should be sharing here. And for those, who are interested in using computer vision and machine learning, the example in the middle, which is I put under my own repository, which is hyperautomation, was an example that was given at the BCS the other day, which is using Selenium and computer vision. So I think it is, I know what it is, but it's completely missed my mind. So it's using Google's computer vision platform to actually recognize objects in the DOM and learn that they're changing, right? So, there is tools that can do that, and that level of ability to use computer vision and ML to self-heal your scripts, right? So if you're using Selenium, you can just plug that in and then use, and leverage it, right? And then obviously I'll just give some extra nods out to other people, but there's obviously Captain for kind of your pipeline build stuff. There's the great stuff that Jason's doing with Test AI and their SDK, which will eventually become more accessible. I'll shout out the other ones for scriptless for Perfecto. They've got their Testcraft. You've got TestModeler.io, who are going to be talking today. You've got UFT, codeless APIs. You've got Applitools, and of course you've got Mabel. So there's so many. Apologies, Mabel, I've missed you off there. Cool vendors that you can use. Now I'm aware that I've only got 3 minutes and I'm going to skip through some segments which I don't actually know that much about. So security is one of those things. I just know that there's a lot to it. I actually was on a call today for the Ministry of Defence in the UK again for doing some security work, and there's some awesome vendors. I'm going to give out some quick shouts to my favorite because we partner with them, but Contrast Security. But there's also Vericode, which we've used at MIT for the COVID project, and many others, like 45, right? So security, I think, is really important, and there would be, I guess, if we had too much more time, there would be more conversation around kind of the shift left approach to maybe static code analysis and scan-based stuff, which your Vericodes of the world and your Zaps tools are going to be able to provide. And then you've got your actively scanning tools that are actually looking at what's happening and threat detection in the real world, which McAfee probably sat on for a long time, but people like Contrast do as well. And I pulled this as literally the last engagement that I did, and I kind of showed all the different stages where I would have automation in a kind of a container pipeline that we would release out into AWS or Azure or wherever it is, and talk about contract testing, talk about how you're spinning up these environments and doing different types of testing at different stages. But let me skip on to something that I know a lot more about as well, which is performance engineering. And so I love performance engineering, and part of what I've done for the last 3 years with Todd DiCaprio and Stuart Moncrief, who writes myloadtest.com, and Todd, who'll be joining us later, who wrote the book Effective Performance Engineering. What we were doing every year is we were doing this independent viewpoint of taking 1 million websites, so what Alexa gives you as the top list, and then we focused it on retail organizations. We monitored those retail organizations, and then we published all these independent reports, and it was really interesting to see this perception around, how Amazon works in one country versus another, where your big Best Buys and stuff, how they performed and what their weaknesses were, and then some of the tooling around that. And we did the same for security and a few other things. So, check out the World Digital Report. And then performance, of course, there's so many great companies out there that sit in this performance space. I'm not going to list them all. 2 of them are now the same company, so I'll just slice those together. But amazing tools in this space, whether or not you're using JMeter, Gatlin, whatever open source one. Taurus is my favorite platform of all time. Sorry, everybody else, but Alon did such a good job with that. But yeah, check out Get Taurus if you've got some time. But some great stuff in the performance landscape as well. And so I wanted to kind of add in, obviously, a few nods to performance, and I wouldn't be able to do it without introing my brother from another mother, Todd DiCaprio, who's going to be talking later. And I took a shot of his talk later because I want you to go off and do it, go and stay around for it because it's so valuable. And he's got a methodology around pipeline telemetry, automated orchestration, which is this concept around monitoring as code, operations as code, being able to build and pull that data from lots of different systems and bring them together. And this was kind of our view of this open data platform, this kind of data cube where you can get all this data into. And I think it's a fantastic session. It'll blow you away. Go and watch it. I will share this available online, but some of the work that we're doing for MIT, as you'd expect, part of it is this is sensitive data as far as location data. So we approached it from a non-traditional APM perspective, and what we called the machine-driven approach, which was taking the data from the individual containers. As you can see here, there's some request response pairs happening for a container that sits in a health authority, taking data in and scrubbing the data off to get rid of the identifiable locations. But because we couldn't put analytics onto the actual device, so the one Google, Apple exposure notifications, like what NHS and GCHQ got into trouble for, we decided to reverse it from the actual endpoints, from the actual nodes, and then build a model of what's actually happening based on the data and what API it's doing to what function. So in theory, it gives us all the same function as the telemetry you'd get on your device, but actually we did it from the machine's perspective. So really interesting approach, and it was the only way at MIT we were able to do it. So it goes on for a while, so I'll avoid going through to it because I know I'm running a little bit behind. But the kind of the message was around data at each one of these points, right? And this was this idea of I know Chris said you've got to capture them all. Like, it's the same viewpoint of you've got to capture these data streams for all the different systems, whether it's your Git ops approach of code, everything as code, YAML, whatever it is, your application models, your release management tools, your environmental management, your network tools. You've got to learn, probe, test, learn this information, and that's what's going to feed these next generation of platforms. And I think, it's not just one tool or even AI ops, as much as I'd like to not say the word, that it's not just one of those tools that's going to be responsible for taking that data. And it's this, things like what Splunk are doing with open telemetry. It's the same kind of thing for open testing, right? We should be able to get these feeds and pull them in from different tools and then use that to process information as per what Paul said. So, as far as this, providing this kind of tool that gives us insight into what are all these systems doing, what are the back end, why is the database getting, get hammered, why is the, the stack trace, showing some, memory issue, there's all this information. I just don't think we've unlocked it yet. And of course, we talk about DevOps, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because there's so much more, and I'm running over a little bit. But part of it is you've got the DevOps tools there, whatever flavor you're using, right? You're building everything, infrastructure, configuration, platform as code, you're terraforming things. It's great. It's all fantastic. But, part of it is, I think we've looked at this in a way that we treat things each in the stage as through the pipeline as individual activities. We don't really stick those, those tools that should be getting the information. So what I class as kind of hyper baselining, which is kind of is multi-dimensional transactional data, right? It's building up data of which you can look at, like kind of what was raised earlier about using Google speed test, right? You've got that happening in one environment which you might be just looking at emulation now, and then you've got real device metrics coming in from telemetry that's coming on the actual devices, like what Alan Page mentions about in how Microsoft tests, where the Xbox on one device in a particular temperature in a very warm climate, going around a particular corner is just lagging there, and it's the GPU and it's maybe the firmware and it's all this other stuff coming into Microsoft Operations Manager to give them a viewpoint that end devices are also having issues here, and you've got those issues also seem to occur in certain different device labs and stuff. So we need to capture this data, and of course I couldn't give anyone else but around a nod here who'll be speaking at 5 o'clock around continuous testing and capturing that information. Again, I'm not going to spend too long on this slide, but the work that I'm doing at MIT, you can probably see at the top is we're having to use machine learning and AI to actually generate millions or billions of combinations of actual locations so that we can run scenarios of people interacting with other people. This was originally when we used the GPS tool. Now we use games. We have to do something very similar because it's at a hardware level. And therefore, of course, another shout out to Perfecto, but real labs, real devices, Bluetooth proximity on games is different on each type of phone, right? You can't emulate it. You can't emulate the Bluetooth antenna, right? You need to actually have all those devices available in the labs and be seeing whether or not you come into contact with them. And of course, in the UK, the RAF actually just set a base up and had people walking around within proximity to each other. But let's do this a little bit more technically. But there's lots of new challenges, and they're not anything to do with UIs, right? So a lot of this information is starting to challenge us, and not just thinking about APIs and UIs, but actually modeling and data engineering underneath it. I'm not going to use the word data engineering in test, because if that ever becomes a thing, I will probably quit. But part of it is, I think we've got to rethink and maybe re-challenge the way that we keep on looking at these models. And again, Alan yesterday kind of mentioned about the fact that it's very much, here's a DevOps methodology, and it's been published in Continuous Delivery, which I've got the book behind me, which is where this is from originally. But part of it, people look at it and go, well, we're doing continuous delivery, and you kind of go, do you mean continuous delivery, or do you mean continuous deployment? Are you checking a piece of code in and it goes into production without any person touching it at all? And if they say no, then you kind of say, well, you're talking about maybe things like feature flags, and you're not thinking about self-healing, you're not thinking about unbreakable pipeline, all the stuff which was defined as DevOps, but we just don't seem to be getting there or far enough around it. And my kind of, the reason why I put this slide up was, I kind of want to kind of challenge the concept of DevOps. I'm done with DevOps, if that's a term that can be used. And I think, you know, ops dev, which is that you have to think about the opposite flow. So we talk about shift left and shift right. It's exactly the same thing with DevOps, is take it from an operational perspective and work your way backwards. And, you know, I love building DevOps teams, and, you know, I've got infrastructure engineers, I've got security engineers, they're doing amazing things, and they're all becoming part of the project team, which is dev focused and dev centric, not ops centric. You know, those resources aren't coming from the operational teams and becoming, you know, the infrastructure guys. You are bringing infrastructure guys in, and then there's still an operational team with infrastructure people in, and you sat there going, operationally this doesn't work. Needs to be ops driven. So I really think we need to go back the other way and understand, well, what is it that we're building? You know, what are these architectures? Start bringing in SRE. SRE is an ops driven approach, not a dev centric approach. You know, chaos engineering sits probably in the middle. We need to address it. I think we've got some big questions in this space, and I know Todd will have a lot of banter to talk about it later, but you've got to watch his session. It is amazing. And I thought I was going to be able to nearly get through an entire presentation without mentioning my TED talk, but I unfortunately failed at the last minute. But, you know, part of the TED talk, which is available, you can literally just go to TED.com and type my name in. That session, which will only take 15 minutes out of your life, unlike this 45-minute session, you know, part of it is I talk about the concept around shifting left and shifting right, and that feedback loop, about the fact that, yes, the iterative development goes like this, but it has an end state, and the end state over here is operational, right? And that needs to have a way to feed back to idealization, and it just isn't there. And I think that's going to be a big change. So go and watch the cognitive engineering one. And the reason why I say it is this, you know, we talk about going back the other way as far as maybe ops dev and AI ops and things like that. But at the same time, we're saying, well, we're talking about test automation, but should we be limiting visual testing like Applitools or something like that, or go, you know, to testing? Shouldn't we be using it for RPA and BPA, business process automation? You know, at a point, there's, you know, two directions to this, and yes, one might be business driven and the other one might be operational driven, and the other one might be dev driven. You know, the three separate things. It seems like we've not put the pieces of the pie together, and I know Curiosity made it onto here as one of the vendors that actually sit in each one of these quadrants. But I think that's the whole point, is I don't think it's that simple. It's not just an iterative approach. It's not just one size fits all. It is, you know, fail fast, learn rapid. It is going from trimodal, multimodal models. You know, it doesn't matter if you're doing waterfall. It doesn't matter if you're doing V model or you're using SAFe. You know, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, these things are happening. You're thinking about them. You're creating and learning. It is the basic blocks that, you know, were there when Hewlett and Packard started their Silicon Valley in their garage, right? They did a think and test, build and test, build and test. And Mark won the calculator that Paul showed the day before. And then you've got people like Tom Gill, who talks about Evo 20 years or however many years before, the agile guys got together skiing. You know, part of it is we know about iterative development. We just need to stop using patterns that were built to design cars and manufacturing and apply them to software. And I think that was what Paul was trying to say, was actually we need to rethink and reappropriate certain things from other industries and blueprints and schematics that may work in Lean and Toyota and stuff, but we also need to develop and mature as an industry. So I think we've got a lot of work that needs to come down the line on that. Paul's going to definitely kick me in a second, because I literally got this abstract through from another conference this morning, which is where I'm going to be talking about shifting right and the work that I did with MIT. And obviously I'm going to skip past that quite quickly. But, you know, what I want you to take away from this, and, you know, we'll probably be in the discussion panel later, is, well, what are those skills that potentially you need to be thinking about? And I think a lot of those skills are, you know, dare I say, the data engineering landscape. It is the way of thinking about those skills, those cognitive skills, whether that be critical thinking or something else. And finally, I guess, you know, the future starts now. You know, I picked this book up, which should be behind me here, from my friend Theo. Theo spoke at the last event we ran, and you know, it's a Bloomberg book. I highly recommend it, but it gives you it's the answers to the questions that you're thinking now, is what skills do I need to be? And he's put there is like, you're a social builder, you're a humanist, you're a a navigator, an explorer, a sense maker, a guardian. There's all these different new roles that you need to be thinking of, or skills that you need to be developing. So check the book out, check out the podcast, the link before. And I'm now sorry, Gareth, I know you're going to be upset with me because you're on next, but I just wanted to take a quick breath and say, thanks, and thanks for all the fish. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to queue up Gareth's session now. I know hopefully we will still get some time to actually put some questions to him. But yeah, so let me just give you a quick introduction. So Gareth is the general manager, is the commander-in-chief now of Eggplant, which has been recently acquired by Keysight. Used to work at Progress and a few other ones. He's amazing, and I'm going to now kick him off slightly behind schedule, but we'll hopefully have some time to ask him. I know he's in the panel, so let's go.